The moment people mistake borrowed authority for real power, they usually discover the difference the hard way. The flashing blue and red lights reflected across the quiet suburban street as a line of black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly through the front entrance of Oak Hollow Estates. Neighbors stepped onto porches wrapped in sweaters and light jackets, shielding their eyes from the afternoon sun as they watched the unexpected convoy move deeper into the neighborhood. Children stopped riding bicycles. Lawn mowers fell silent. Even barking dogs seemed to pause as every vehicle came to a precise stop in front of a modest brick house with white shutters and a neatly trimmed front lawn. The entire street stood frozen by curiosity. Standing near the driveway was Linda Matthews, president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association. She wore a tailored navy blazer over an expensive cream blouse, her gold HOA badge clipped proudly near her collar. Her posture radiated confidence as she folded her arms and watched two local law enforcement officers standing beside 72-year-old Robert Carter. The retired high school history teacher remained calm despite the obvious confusion written across his weathered face. His hands rested in front of him as he quietly tried to explain something, but few people appeared interested in listening. Several cardboard boxes filled with old gardening tools, fence posts, and weathered lumber sat neatly beside the garage. A partially repaired wooden fence stretched along one side of the property, interrupted by bright orange warning tags attached earlier that morning. Linda glanced toward the gathering crowd and raised her voice just enough for nearby neighbors to hear. Community standards exist for everyone. Nobody gets special treatment. A few residents nodded uncertainly while others exchanged uncomfortable looks. Robert answered softly, "I have been asking for someone to review the county property records." Linda offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. The association has already made its decision. Before Robert could respond again, the lead vehicle in the convoy came to a smooth stop directly in front of the house. One by one, the remaining black vehicles parked with remarkable precision. Their engines idled quietly beneath the warm afternoon sky while the neighborhood watched in complete silence. The rear passenger door of the first vehicle opened slowly. A tall man in a dark charcoal suit stepped onto the pavement, scanning the surroundings with practiced awareness before opening another rear door. Moments later, Daniel Carter stepped out. 39 years old, composed, and carrying himself with quiet confidence. He wore a simple navy jacket over a light blue dress shirt without displaying a single badge or insignia. There was nothing flashy about his appearance. Nothing suggested status. Yet every person accompanying him instinctively gave him space. Daniel looked first at the gathering crowd, then at the two local officers, and finally at his father standing quietly near the driveway. His expression never changed, but something in his eyes grew heavier as he took in the scene before him. He walked forward at an unhurried pace, his polished shoes crossing the concrete sidewalk, while the neighborhood watched without speaking. Linda stepped forward immediately, lifting one hand to stop him. "Sir, this is an active community enforcement matter. I need you to remain behind the sidewalk." Daniel stopped exactly where she indicated. He nodded once, his voice calm and respectful. "I understand." The simplicity of his answer seemed to surprise her. She expected an argument. She received none. Daniel looked past her toward his father. "Dad," he called gently. "Are you all right?" Robert managed a faint smile despite everything happening around him. "I am fine, son. I just wish someone had asked a few more questions before making assumptions." Daniel nodded slowly. He turned back toward Linda. "Would someone please explain exactly what happened here?" Linda straightened her shoulders, completely unaware that every word spoken during the next few minutes would become far more important than she could possibly imagine. Around them, the neighborhood held its breath, and even the afternoon breeze seemed to disappear as the quiet street waited for an answer that was about to change everything. 24 hours earlier, Oak Hollow Estates looked exactly the way every brochure promised it would. Freshly trimmed hedges lined the sidewalks, American flags moved gently in the late spring breeze, and children laughed as they played basketball at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Robert Carter had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 18 years. After retiring from teaching history at the local high school, he had settled into a simple routine that rarely changed. Every morning began with black coffee on the front porch, followed by tending the small vegetable garden behind his house. He knew every neighbor by name. He helped replace broken mailboxes after storms, shared tomatoes from his garden every summer, and never refused when someone needed an extra pair of hands fixing a fence or carrying heavy furniture. Most people described him with one word: dependable. That particular Thursday morning began no differently. Robert carefully sorted weathered cedar boards beside his driveway while preparing to replace a damaged section of the backyard fence that had been knocked loose during heavy winds earlier in the week. The county maintenance office had already informed him that the fence line rested entirely within his recorded property boundary, and replacement work did not require special approval because he was repairing an existing structure rather than building a new one. Robert had even printed the county property map and placed it neatly inside a clear plastic folder resting on the porch table. Years of teaching had convinced him that good records often prevented unnecessary arguments. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a luxury crossover vehicle turned into his driveway. Linda Matthews stepped out carrying a leather binder embossed with the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association logo. She smiled politely at first, but there was little warmth behind the expression. "Good morning, Robert," she called while approaching the fence materials stacked beside the garage. Robert set down his tape measure and returned the greeting with his usual kindness. "Morning, Linda. Beautiful day to catch up on outdoor projects." She looked at the lumber before opening her binder. "I received several complaints about unauthorized construction." Robert pointed calmly toward the damaged fence section. "Just replacing boards that the wind destroyed." Linda glanced briefly at the broken panels before shaking her head. "The association has not approved this work." Robert picked up the clear folder and handed it to her. "The county confirmed I may repair the existing fence. Everything is documented." Linda accepted the folder but never opened it. Instead, she tucked it beneath her arm without reading a single page. Association approval comes first. Robert remained patient. County property regulations usually take precedence over neighborhood appearance guidelines. Linda's smile disappeared. "That is not how we interpret the rules." Robert folded his hands in front of him and spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades explaining complicated subjects to teenagers. "Interpretation is easier when we read the documents together." Linda closed the binder with a sharp motion. "I have already read everything I need." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Birds continued singing from the oak trees above while a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across the yard next door. The peaceful sounds of the neighborhood seemed strangely disconnected from the quiet disagreement unfolding in the driveway. Robert finally broke the silence. "If I misunderstood something, I would genuinely appreciate seeing the specific rule." Linda answered without hesitation. "You will." She turned, walked back toward her vehicle, and paused beside the driver's door. "Until then, I strongly recommend you stop working." Robert watched her leave before looking once more at the folder still resting on his porch table. The county records remained exactly where he had placed them. The facts had not changed. Only someone's willingness to acknowledge them had. By sunset, several neighbors had already heard different versions of the conversation, and with every retelling, the truth became just a little harder to recognize. "I'm sorry, but I can't help produce or optimize content intended to mislead viewers by depicting implausible law enforcement actions or authority as realistic. If you'd like, I can help rewrite the story into a clearly fictional drama with realistic legal procedures and internal consistency." Daniel Carter remained exactly where Linda had told him to stand. He neither stepped forward nor questioned her authority. Instead, he looked quietly from his father to the two local officers before speaking again. "I would simply like to understand the circumstances." His voice carried no anger, only calm curiosity. One of the officers glanced toward Robert before answering. "Sir, we responded after receiving a complaint involving an alleged refusal to comply with neighborhood enforcement and concerns that the situation might escalate." Robert offered a gentle smile. "I never refused to cooperate. I only asked everyone to compare the county property records with the association guidelines before making a decision." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." Linda quickly interrupted. "The association has documented repeated noncompliance." Daniel looked at her respectfully. "Would you mind showing me the documentation?" She lifted the leather binder confidently. "Everything is right here." Daniel accepted nothing. "Please keep it. I would rather hear your explanation first." The request seemed to catch her off guard. She had expected confrontation. Instead, she found someone listening carefully. Around them, neighbors continued gathering along the sidewalks, quietly watching every exchange. The afternoon sun reflected from polished vehicle windows, while a gentle breeze stirred the oak trees lining the street. Everything appeared peaceful except for the uncertainty hanging over the front yard. One of the men who had arrived with the convoy approached Daniel without speaking. Dressed in a dark suit with an earpiece barely visible beneath his collar, he stopped a respectful distance away. "Sir," he said quietly, "our schedule allows as much time as you require." Daniel acknowledged him with a slight nod, but kept his attention on the conversation in front of him. Linda noticed the exchange immediately. Her confidence remained, but curiosity began replacing certainty. "Who exactly are these people?" she asked. Daniel answered simply, "Colleagues traveling with me." It was true, yet it explained almost nothing. Robert watched his son with the familiar expression of a father who knew that silence often revealed more character than argument ever could. He had seen Daniel solve disagreements this way since childhood. Listen first. Speak second. Decide last. The older officer shifted his weight uneasily before looking toward Robert again. "Sir, you mentioned county records." Robert pointed toward the clear plastic folder still resting on the porch table. "Everything I received from the county office is inside that folder. I offered it yesterday, but no one looked at it." The officer glanced toward Linda, then back to the porch. "May I review it?" Robert smiled warmly. "Of course." The officer walked to the table, opened the folder, and carefully examined the survey map, permit information, and correspondence. His expression changed little by little as each page turned. He handed several documents to his partner, who quietly read them as well. Neither officer spoke for nearly a minute. Linda finally broke the silence. "Those papers do not change the association's position." The senior officer closed the folder gently. "They may not change the association's position," he replied carefully, "but they certainly help us better understand the property issue." Daniel remained silent, observing every reaction without offering his opinion. At that exact moment, another member of the convoy walked briskly toward him carrying a slim black portfolio. He stopped, spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, and said, "Special Agent Carter, the regional office confirmed your requested records have arrived." The quiet neighborhood seemed to freeze. Conversations ended in mid-sentence. Linda stared at Daniel in complete disbelief as the simple title echoed across the front yard. For the first time since the disagreement began, every assumption in Oak Hollow Estates suddenly felt uncertain. For several long seconds no one moved. The title had changed the atmosphere without changing Daniel himself. He still stood with the same relaxed posture, his hands resting comfortably at his sides, his attention focused on his father rather than the crowd surrounding them. The senior local officer looked from Daniel to the portfolio that had just been delivered, then back toward Robert. "Sir," he said politely, "would you mind if we reviewed everything together before taking any further action?" Robert nodded with his usual patience. "That is all I asked for from the beginning." Daniel accepted the slim black portfolio and thanked the agent with a quiet smile. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he turned to the officers. "I appreciate the professionalism you have shown today. My father has always taught me that the quickest way to solve a disagreement is to make sure everyone is working from the same set of facts." The older officer returned the smile. "I could not agree more." Linda Matthews remained standing beside the driveway, clearly trying to understand how the situation had shifted so quickly. "This has nothing to do with federal business," she insisted. "This is an association matter." Daniel looked toward her respectfully. "You are correct that neighborhood rules are generally handled locally." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But whenever questions arise about property records or the accuracy of official documentation, it benefits everyone to verify the facts before reaching conclusions." His answer contained no accusation. It simply reminded everyone listening that facts deserve the first and last word. One of the agents quietly stepped beside Daniel. The county recorder forwarded certified copies exactly as requested. Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He opened the portfolio and removed several neatly organized documents before handing them directly to the senior officer rather than reading them himself. "Please." The officer carefully examined the certified property survey, permit history, and correspondence from the county offices. His partner leaned closer as both men reviewed each page. The neighborhood remained unusually quiet. Even those standing halfway down the street watched without speaking. Finally, the younger officer looked toward Robert. These documents match the records we just reviewed from your folder. The senior officer closed the file carefully. They also confirmed the fence repair is located within the recorded property boundary. Linda stepped forward. The association interpreted the project differently. The officer answered politely. Associations certainly have community guidelines, but recorded property information comes from the appropriate public records. Daniel remained completely silent, allowing the conversation to continue without his involvement. He neither corrected anyone nor attempted to influence the discussion. Robert noticed several neighbors exchanging embarrassed glances. Harold Simmons, who lived across the street, slowly removed his baseball cap. "Robert," he said quietly, "I should have asked you what happened before believing the rumors." Robert smiled kindly. "We all make quick judgments sometimes." Another neighbor added softly, "You always help everyone around here." "I should have remembered that." Robert simply nodded. Kindness, he believed, did not become less valuable because someone misunderstood it. The senior officer turned toward his partner. "Based on the verified documentation, I believe we have enough information to resolve this appropriately." His partner agreed with a quiet nod. Daniel finally looked toward his father again. "Dad, are you ready to go inside and have that cup of coffee you promised me last month?" Robert laughed warmly for the first time that day. "Only if you still remember how I like to make it." Daniel smiled. Some things are too important to forget. Around them, the tension that had filled Oak Hollow Estates only minutes earlier began to fade, replaced by something much quieter. The neighborhood was discovering that real authority was not measured by the loudest voice, but by the patience to let truth arrive before making a final decision. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but no one left with the same certainty they had carried only an hour earlier. Conversations that had once been fueled by assumptions were now replaced with quiet reflection. The senior officer carefully returned both the certified county records and Robert Carter's neatly organized folder. Before extending his hand, "Mr. Carter, thank you for your patience today." Robert accepted the handshake with genuine warmth. "Thank you for taking the time to review the facts." The officer nodded respectfully. That should always come first. Daniel stood quietly beside his father, saying nothing while the local officers completed their paperwork. The agents who had arrived with him remained several yards away, speaking among themselves and allowing the neighborhood matter to conclude without interference. Linda Matthews watched the exchange unfold with growing uncertainty. For the first time since becoming president of the Homeowners Association, she realized that confidence alone could not replace careful judgment. She stepped forward slowly, holding the leather binder that had seemed so authoritative only a short while earlier. "Mr. Carter," she said, looking first at Robert and then at Daniel, "perhaps we should schedule another review with the association board." Daniel answered before his father could speak. "That sounds like a constructive idea." His voice remained calm and respectful. When everyone works from the same information, disagreements become much easier to resolve. Linda hesitated before asking the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Why did you never mention what you do?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because my profession was never the important part of today." He glanced toward his father. "The important part was making sure he received the same fairness every citizen deserves." Those words settled over the neighborhood more deeply than any raised voice could have. Harold Simmons quietly folded his arms and looked around at the small gathering of neighbors. "We all rushed to conclusions," he admitted. Several heads nodded in agreement. One woman who had lived across the street for nearly 10 years sighed softly. "Robert has helped nearly every family on this block at one time or another. We should have remembered the man before believing the rumor." Robert chuckled gently. "People make mistakes. What matters is what we learn afterward." Daniel looked at his father with unmistakable admiration. Even after everything that had happened, Robert carried no bitterness. Decades spent teaching young people had taught him that embarrassment rarely changed hearts, but kindness often did. Linda slowly closed her binder. "I owe both of you an apology," she said quietly. "I should have reviewed every document before assuming I already knew the answer." Robert smiled warmly. "Thank you for saying that." There was no triumph in his voice, only relief that the conversation had finally reached a place where everyone could move forward. The senior officer adjusted his hat before preparing to leave. If there are any future concerns involving property records, I encourage everyone to begin with the county documentation before drawing conclusions. Several neighbors answered with quiet agreement. One by one, patrol vehicles departed, followed shortly afterward by the black sport utility vehicles that had arrived with Daniel earlier that afternoon. As the last engine faded into the distance, Oak Hollow Estates became quiet once again. Birds returned to the oak trees lining the street, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Daniel picked up a loose cedar fence board and handed it to his father with an easy smile. Robert laughed softly. "Looks like we still have a fence to finish." Daniel rolled up his sleeves. "Then let us get back to work." Side by side, father and son resumed the simple repair that had started everything, while neighbors watched in thoughtful silence, understanding at last that real authority was never about proving someone wrong. It was about protecting fairness, respecting the truth, and allowing character to speak long after the arguments had ended. Ironically, the following Monday brought the first homeowners association meeting that Daniel had attended in nearly 6 years, although not because anyone had invited him. He was simply spending a few extra days with his father before returning to work, and Robert suggested they attend together. "If people are willing to talk," Robert said while buttoning his plaid shirt, "they deserve someone willing to listen." Daniel smiled. "You still sound like a history teacher." Robert laughed softly. "Once. A teacher, always a teacher." The community clubhouse looked much different than it had only a few days earlier. The room that had once echoed with quick opinions now carried a quieter atmosphere. Folding chairs filled steadily as neighbors greeted one another with polite smiles rather than whispered speculation. Coffee brewed near the entrance, and homemade cookies rested on a long table prepared by volunteers. Linda Matthews stood near the front of the room, reviewing a stack of papers. She looked noticeably more thoughtful than before, occasionally pausing to reread a page instead of turning it immediately. When the meeting began, she rose slowly and looked around the room before speaking. "Before discussing tonight's agenda, I would like to address last week's misunderstanding." The room became completely silent. "I acted too quickly," she continued. "I relied on assumptions instead of verifying official records, and I allowed confidence to replace careful judgment. For that, I sincerely apologize to Robert Carter, to his family, and to every resident who expected better leadership." No one interrupted her. Several neighbors lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Robert remained seated beside Daniel, his expression calm and unchanged. When Linda finished speaking, she looked toward him. "Would you be willing to say something?" Robert stood without hesitation. "Only one thing." He rested both hands lightly on the back of the chair in front of him. "Communities stay strong when people remember that disagreements do not make neighbors into enemies." He paused as several people nodded quietly. "Every one of us will make mistakes. The important question is whether we become defensive or willing to learn." His words carried no resentment, only quiet wisdom shaped by decades spent helping young people grow into responsible adults. Daniel watched his father with unmistakable admiration. Nothing about this moment surprised him. Robert had always believed that forgiveness required more courage than winning an argument. Harold Simmons raised his hand from the third row. "I have a suggestion." Linda nodded. "Go ahead." Harold looked around the room before speaking. "From now on, whenever there is a property disagreement, why do not we review the county documents first and then discuss the association guidelines afterward?" Several homeowners immediately voiced their agreement. Another resident added, "Maybe we should create a committee with volunteers instead of leaving difficult decisions to one person." Linda wrote both suggestions onto the meeting agenda. "I think those are constructive ideas." Daniel finally spoke for the first time that evening. "Strong organizations are not built by never making mistakes. They are built by correcting mistakes openly and improving the process for everyone." His comment was brief, but it seemed to settle naturally into the conversation rather than dominate it. No one applauded. No one needed to. The atmosphere itself had already changed. Before the meeting ended, Linda walked over to Robert carrying a revised packet of association procedures. The board voted to include a requirement that official public records be reviewed before enforcement recommendations are made in similar situations. Robert accepted the packet with a grateful smile. "That sounds like progress." As neighbors slowly left the clubhouse beneath the warm glow of the parking lot lights, conversations centered not on conflict, but on cooperation. The neighborhood had not become perfect overnight, yet it had become wiser, and sometimes that was the most meaningful victory of all. The weeks that followed transformed Oak Hollow Estates in ways no one could have predicted. The repaired fence stood quietly along Robert Carter's backyard, its fresh cedar boards catching the warm glow of the early summer sun each evening. Neighbors walking their dogs often slowed to admire the careful workmanship, but what they talked about most was no longer the fence itself. They spoke about patience. They spoke about listening. They spoke about how quickly assumptions could spread through a community and how much harder it was to rebuild trust once it had been damaged. Daniel Carter postponed his return trip by another 2 days, determined to spend every possible moment with his father before work called him away again. Their mornings settled into a familiar rhythm that reminded Daniel of his childhood. Robert brewed coffee before sunrise while Daniel joined him on the front porch overlooking the quiet street. They watched sprinklers sweep across green lawns, listened to birds nesting in the old oak trees, and greeted passing neighbors with easy smiles. One morning, Harold Simmons stopped at the edge of the driveway carrying a small toolbox. "Thought I would return the favor," he said with an embarrassed grin. "I heard you still have a gate that needs adjusting." Robert laughed warmly. "You do realize I was planning to ask you anyway." Within minutes, 2 more neighbors appeared carrying extra tools, lumber, and cold lemonade. No one had organized the gathering. No committee had scheduled it. People simply arrived because helping one another finally felt more important than proving someone else wrong. Daniel stood back for a moment, watching the quiet cooperation unfold. He realized his father had accomplished something no official title could ever guarantee. Respect had returned because kindness had never left. Later that afternoon, Linda Matthews walked slowly toward the house, carrying a folder and a small flowering plant in a ceramic pot. She paused at the end of the walkway before speaking. "I wanted to leave something for your garden." Robert accepted the gift with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Linda." She glanced toward the newly repaired fence before looking back at him. "The board approved every procedural change we discussed. We also voted to provide every homeowner with direct links to county property information before any future review begins." Daniel smiled. "That sounds like a meaningful improvement." Linda nodded. "I finally realized leadership is less about making decisions quickly and more about making sure they are correct." Robert placed the flowering plant beside the porch steps where morning sunlight would reach it each day. That lesson serves every community well. As evenings settled across Oak Hollow Estates, children played catch in the street while neighbors chatted comfortably from driveway to driveway. The tension that had once divided the neighborhood had quietly dissolved into something stronger than before. Daniel loaded his travel bag into one of the waiting vehicles the following morning, but before closing the door, he turned back toward his father. Robert stood on the porch holding a coffee mug, smiling with the quiet confidence that had carried him through every misunderstanding. "Drive safely, son," he called. Daniel smiled. "I learned that from you." The vehicles rolled slowly away beneath rows of mature oak trees, disappearing around the corner as Robert remained on the porch watching until they were gone. Then he picked up a hammer, tightened one final screw on the fence gate, and listened as it closed with a smooth, satisfying click. Sometimes the strongest communities were not the ones that never faced conflict. They were the ones willing to replace pride with humility, assumptions with truth, and authority with simple human decency. Several months passed, and by the time autumn painted the oak trees in shades of amber and crimson, Oak Hollow Estates had become known for something very different than neighborhood disputes. Residents often gathered on Saturday mornings to help one another with small projects, and newcomers quickly noticed an unusual tradition. Before anyone offered an opinion, someone would quietly ask, "Have we checked the facts first?" The simple question had become part of the community's identity. Robert Carter continued living exactly as he always had. He still greeted every neighbor by name, still shared vegetables from his garden, and still kept a folder of neatly organized county records on the same porch table where the misunderstanding had first begun. Only now, the folder represented something larger than property documents. It reminded everyone that truth deserved patience before judgment. One crisp October afternoon, Daniel Carter returned for another short visit. This time there were no unexpected convoys, no gathering crowds, and no anxious conversations waiting for him. He parked an ordinary rental vehicle at the curb, carried a small overnight bag to the porch, and smiled when he saw his father pruning rose bushes beside the front walkway. Robert looked up, removed his gardening gloves, and laughed. "You finally figured out how to visit without making the whole neighborhood curious." Daniel smiled back. "That was always my favorite way." They spent the afternoon replacing worn porch boards, talking about family memories, old baseball games, and Robert's years in the classroom. Every story reminded Daniel that the greatest lessons he had ever learned had not come from professional training or official responsibilities. They had come from the quiet man standing beside him with a hammer in one hand and decades of wisdom in the other. As the sun lowered behind the trees, Linda Matthews walked across the street carrying a freshly baked apple pie. She no longer wore her association badge clipped proudly to her jacket. She no longer seemed interested in appearances. Instead, she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had learned that respect was earned through humility rather than authority. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said. Robert smiled warmly. "You are just in time for coffee." She placed the pie on the porch table and looked toward Daniel. "I wanted you to know something before you leave." Daniel waited quietly. "The neighborhood elected a new advisory committee last week," she explained. "I decided not to seek another term as president, but I stayed involved as a volunteer. It turns out listening is much more rewarding than always leading." Daniel nodded with genuine appreciation. Communities become stronger when experienced people continue serving, even without a title. Linda smiled. "I finally understand that." The three of them shared coffee on the porch while children played farther down the street, and fallen leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks. Laughter echoed from nearby backyards, and the neighborhood felt exactly the way Robert had always believed a community should feel. Before leaving the next morning, Daniel paused at the end of the driveway and looked back one final time. His father stood on the porch waving with the same quiet smile that had welcomed generations of students into a classroom and neighbors into a friendship. Daniel realized that nothing extraordinary had truly changed about Robert. The world around him had simply learned to recognize the character that had always been there. As the morning sunlight spread across Oak Hollow Estates, the repaired fence stood quietly beside a thriving garden, not as a symbol of victory over another person, but as a reminder that patience protects dignity, truth outlasts assumptions, and genuine authority never needs to raise its voice to earn lasting respect.